It is now my deep honor and pleasure to introduce you to one of my dear friends, Seamus Riley. Seamus is an architectural designer at Smith Group. He was also a former intern at Objective Standard Institute, but he now advocates for capitalism and as a member of Project Liberal. He's also a massive life lover, and in his spare time he sings and dances swing. So without further ado, Seamus on From Anxiety to Serenity.
All right, everybody. Well, as Angel mentioned, I'm an architectural designer, and I'm an objectivist. And before I delve into a pretty serious topic, I want to start with something fun and see if anyone can guess my favorite character in all of fiction. You don't have to say it out loud, but you might think that it would be Howard Rourke, my fellow architect, fellow objectivist. But actually, it's a Walt Disney character. Bert the Chimney Sweep. Before I even knew how to read, I loved Bert because he has the best dance moves. But he also has a very simple philosophy. I does what I likes, and I likes what I do. Just like Howard Rourke, Bert is an artist, and he does things his own way. But what really inspired me about Bert was his radiant soul. It seemed like Bert could never be anxious or tormented, which is amazing because apart from his demeanor, Bert is just like a modern anxious teen. He's flat broke, he's never going to afford a house, he's got no job offers, and he can't seem to get a girlfriend. Mary Poppins blows him off. Scores of young people today are totally socially anxious, generally anxious, and they're still young. Meanwhile, Bert's like 40. It's really over for him, and yet it's not. He draws his chalk art, and he loves his life. Even when nobody gives him a copper that day, he doesn't just keep living, he keeps thriving. He seems to embody the state of mind that years later I would hear Rand describe through Howard Rourke, who says, "I'm not capable of suffering completely. I never have. It only goes down to a certain point, and then it stops. As long as there's that untouched point, it's not really pain." When I read this line for the first time, I was in a really dark period of my life, and I didn't understand it. What is this certain point that Rand describes? And if we could learn this state of mind, wouldn't that be the most crucial thing that philosophy has to offer? More crucial than correct opinions on art or epistemology or politics. The psychological power that no matter how hard you fail or get embarrassed or feel like you're down and out, to never lose that spark in your soul. That was what revolutionized my life, and that is my topic today. Not curing anxiety, but building a philosophic foundation from which we can master anxiety and stand tall. First, what is anxiety and where does it come from? We might know it first by physical symptoms. Cold sweat, racing heart, hyperventilation. I'm probably having several of these right now. But at core, anxiety is a mental experience of apprehension, worry, or repetitive self-doubt. It can rise to the level of a disorder, like social anxiety disorder, or generalized anxiety disorder, or agoraphobia. But all that matters for the purposes of this talk is that however we experience it, anxiety is an emotion of unease and inner conflict. What do we know about our emotions? The American Psychological Association says it's a reaction pattern involving physiological elements determined by the significance of an event. So if you want to avoid anxiety, just avoid any significant events in your life. Problem solved. But how about a philosophic definition? The Oxford Handbook of Philosophy says a dynamic state involving evaluative appraisals directed at specific objects or events. So in either case, it seems like events are involved. What this doesn't explain to me, though, is how a single event can happen, and I can feel anxious about it, but Bert doesn't. How is it that an event can cause different emotions in different people? And here I find Ayn Rand's definition clarifying. She says, An emotion is an automatic response, an automatic effect of man's value premises. A rational man knows or makes it a point to discover the source of his emotions, the basic premises from which they come. And if his premises are wrong, he corrects them. So Ayn Rand agrees in some sense with the prior definitions. I can't just choose to not be anxious. An emotion is automatic. But we get this crucial idea of a premise. And this can help us explain why an event can cause different emotions in different people. Let's consider that I'm out walking in the park and I get charged by a big old dog. If I came from a family where we had a big friendly dog and I get charged by a dog in the park, I feel joy. I feel joy on the premise that big dogs are friendly. Alternatively, if I was raised in the slums where dogs are used for attacking intruders and protecting your property and I get charged by a dog in the park, I might feel fear when I get charged. I feel fear on the premise that big dogs are fearsome. But when an emotion isn't just a momentary flash of panic, when it becomes a constant burden and a repeated pattern, it suggests that a deeper philosophic premise is at play. Suppose you were raised in a family where your dad was always working and he was always stressed about work. He didn't have a good relationship with it and he never took a rest. He said there was no time for it. You might inherit his premise that there's no time for rest, and you might yourself experience anxiety if you aren't working every moment or if you're not getting high marks at work. Alternatively, say you came from a family where your parents were always fighting and you had to help them feel better. You had to comfort your parents. You might have induced the premise that pleasing people is all that matters because, as a child, pleasing people kind of was the only thing that mattered. It was the only way for you to stitch the team back together and go back to getting loved. Oftentimes, premises don't just go back to your parents or their parents before them. The most widespread and pernicious premises are carried throughout entire societies by philosophic traditions and religions. So what I want to do today is look at 3 anxious premises that tormented me when I was a depressed and anxious young man just learning to think for myself. And as we go through them, we're going to look at the rational alternatives. The 3 premises I've selected are duty, primacy of consciousness, and mind over matter, and we'll take them in turn. Duty is when you feel like you have to do something, even though you hate it. I hated all of my general education classes in school. I had already decided I wanted to be an architect, and these English writing assignments were completely pointless. Still, I felt a duty to my parents and to my academic potential to pour all of my productive effort into work I hated. I could have just blown it off. I could have been like Bert, said to hell with my academic potential and focused on things I loved doing, but that was unthinkable to me. When I could steal time, my sister and I had set about building an entire village of custom homes in a video game called Terraria. Years later, it would occur to me in working on commercial hospitals that the workflow that had existed between my younger sister and I in putting together these buildings was identical to the workflow between myself and my interior designers professionally. I was training myself somehow, and yet all of the English writing assignments, I don't remember a single one of them. It was a haze of drudge work. Yet for all of my youth, I felt shameful anxiety when I was playing video games and a constant nagging duty to make myself right. That was the first anxious premise, but it was just the start. The second anxious premise is primacy of consciousness. This is the idea that reality is determined by what people think in their heads. We encounter this whenever we ask someone why, and they say, because I said so, that's why. Duty had chained me to all the work I hated, but primacy of consciousness threatened the work that I loved because after a few months of designing buildings in architecture school, I stopped thinking about whether I thought my designs were good. I only thought about whether my professors would like them. I was constantly anxious about what everyone thought of me. Teachers, peers, family, all needed to be impressed in order to prove to them that I was good. I held the premise that conscious perceptions were what really counted. The low point was when, in the design of my capstone project, I considered basing my design off of a survey of student opinions. Thankfully, this proved logistically impractical, and I was forced to think at least somewhat for myself. But nevertheless, The primacy of consciousness had turned me into an anxious people pleaser and a husk of myself. The alternative to primacy of consciousness is primacy of existence. It is the existing facts that matter, not anyone's opinion. I could have said, so what? So what if my professor doesn't like my design? So what if my classmates think I'm weird? I could have just been the person I wanted to be and let everyone's opinion wash over. But everyone agreed it's not what you know, it's who you know. And my anxious primacy of consciousness premise agreed. My third anxious premise goes hand in hand with the former. In philosophy, it's classified, I think, technically as non-identity and has many manifestations. But it manifested in my mind as this premise of mind over matter. Mind over matter says that your body has no specific nature and can be simply willed to change. I had a post-it note pinned up above my desk at home with two questions. Do I have the means, and do I have the will? And the idea was that if I just have the physical tools to complete a task and the desire to will completion into existence, that should be enough. Even if I was tired, even if I hadn't learned a process by which to achieve my goals, my mind should just operate like a ghost driving a meat suit, unencumbered by trivialities like sleep and food and habit and motivation. I should just do. The alternative to mind over matter is mind-body integration, the philosophic fact that we each have a specific, integrated identity. As Aristotle would say, A is A. It is what it is. My mind can't force my body to be capable of anything just because I wish it so, because my mind is my body. My mind cannot rule over matter because my mind is made of matter. As Francis Bacon puts it, nature to be commanded must be obeyed. But I didn't want to obey my nature. I wanted my nature to simply obey my daily whim. My father had always told me, mind over matter, mind over matter. I wanted to wish myself to work harder, wish myself to like writing, wish myself to focus on things I found boring, wish myself to be something I was not. In college, I would pull an all-nighter, and I would skip breakfast in the morning, and I would go to class, and then skip lunch, go back to class, come back home, crash for a few hours on the couch, wake up, go back to anxiously procrastinating on the work I didn't want to do, and then I'd start writing through a haze of tears at about 3 a.m. In philosophic terms, I didn't exist. I was my own slave. Now, for the record, all of these are primacy of consciousness, all three of these premises. Duty is primacy of consciousness applied to the field of ethics, and mind over matter is primacy of consciousness applied to your own self-control and self-regulation. The reason I broke them out as these three separate things is because on a psychological level, these were three separate patterns. Duty chained me to my work. Primacy of consciousness made the work I did do less rewarding. I felt hollow in it because it wasn't really mine. And mind over matter made me ignore my body's signals that I was underweight, terrible health at the time, just totally overworked. Together, these three premises made my life a constant cycle of torment. I didn't feel like Bert. I felt like Pink, my goddess, who says, every day I fight a war against the mirror. I can't take the person staring back at me. I'm a hazard to myself. Don't let me get me. I'm my own worst enemy. It's bad when you annoy yourself. So irritating. I don't want to be my friend no more. I want to be somebody else. It felt like it had always been this way. I remember I was 7 when I'd become very anxious about hell. And I prayed every night for God to protect my family. I prayed extra hard because I knew none of them were praying. I fantasized that one day I would have to swim through lava in order to save them because apparently when you're 7, that's the most painful thing you can imagine. I remember I was 9 years old, banging my head against a bedpost when I first told my mom that I wanted to die. She was mortified. She said, "Honey, don't say that. It hurts me very badly when you say that." So from then on, I never said it. My family was not wealthy. 6 people and 8 dogs in a 2-room cottage struggled to make ends meet in the wake of the 2008 recession. My parents both worked multiple jobs, and my siblings and I all worked in landscaping to help support the family unit. My father's health was beginning to decline, and when I or my brothers got lazy on the job, he was the one who suffered. My parents fought constantly when they saw each other, and my older brother and I would divide and conquer, each of us taking one parent and allowing them to vent their frustrations until we were ready to stitch the team back together. Soon, I could win almost any argument with my father. He was fiercely proud that his son was precocious, and he boasted to all of his coworkers about my inventions and my work in the garden. He told me that one day I would help get the family out of this mess we were in. I was 11 when I began to have panic attacks. I would run away from my family's crowded little house and walk through the woods, kicking myself for letting everyone down again, for letting myself down, replaying what I should have done different. By the start of high school, I was gloomy and cynical. I was a self-identified pessimist, listening mostly to Simon and Garfunkel music. I condescended to my parents that life was a series of catastrophes strung together by temporary delusions of happiness. Secretly, I was already convinced I would not live to be 19. Well, my estimate was not far off. I was 19 and almost through community college when years of philosophic erosion came to a head. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I felt like I was a defective product, needing to be discarded. One winter night, my poor mother received a phone call informing her that her son was in the custody of law enforcement and that he'd been arrested after climbing over the railing of a 200-foot interstate river bridge. That was the second time my mom heard that I'd wanted to die. You know, in It's a Wonderful Life, when George Bailey comes back from his suicide attempt, if I lose my emotional composition, it's only because of my brother. I'll blame him. No. You know, in It's a Wonderful Life, when George Bailey comes back from his suicide attempt, I love you, Quinn. He's flocked by loving family and friends, and everything in his life suddenly gets better as if by divine intervention. And I'll tell you right now, it didn't feel like that. In my head, it was like a cacophony of anxious voices had suddenly gone eerily quiet. After the hospital conducted my risk assessment, my dad called me on the ride home to lecture me about how thoughtless and selfish I'd been in doing what I did, and how bad it had made him feel. And I remember his words just kind of playing in the background of the car, like a song on the radio turned way down. The rest of my family looked at me with haunted apprehension, like a dead man walking. I sat in my room feeling blank, like a television that had blown a circuit. For the first time in my life, I felt nothing. But some dim curiosity led me to pick up a book I had laying around that I'd bought on recommendation from a YouTuber, and that book was The Fountainhead. And my life was about to change forever. The Fountainhead didn't open with a set of philosophic premises, and if it had, I wouldn't have understood them. Instead, it painted a picture of a different kind of life, a life of my own, unconcerned with grades, family financials, agricultural yields, deadlines, academic potential, or good impressions. Strangely, it sounded familiar, like it was a kind of life I'd once known when I was little, running around and playing in the sandbox till I felt tired, taking a nap whenever I felt like it, and trying to learn to dance like Bert the Chimney Sweep. And yet Ayn Rand gave me a clarity that Walt Disney never had. Duty? Rand cast it aside. I do not recognize anyone's right to 1 minute of my life, nor to any part of my energy, nor to any achievement of mine, no matter who makes the claim, how large their number, or how great their need. Primacy of consciousness? Rand knew it well. They have no concern for facts, ideas, or work. They're concerned only with people. They don't ask, is this true? They ask, is this what others think is true? Not to judge, but to repeat. Not to do, but to give the impression of doing. Not creation, but show. I remember waking up peacefully one morning after reading the book and suddenly having the urge to draw. I sat down at my desk and I drew a redesigned floor plan of my parents' tiny home. Floor plan here. It was radical, expansive, ostentatious. I realized that in all my months of architecture school, this was the first time I had simply drawn a design the way I wanted to. That's when the eerie silence began to recede, and in its place was a laughter of ideas, things I suddenly, childishly wanted to do and to try. I began to notice myself thinking alien thoughts like, that sounds like a you problem, and I'm not too worried about it. For the first time in my life, I was not anxious. I was serene and unafraid. All right, good job, everybody. We did it. We solved anxiety. You just reject a few philosophic premises and you're 0 to hero. Actually, what I was thinking at the time was, what the heck just happened? I felt like for sure any moment the doors would slam shut and I'd be back in the dark world. But in the meantime, I promised myself I wasn't going to waste this strange moment of not hating myself. By some miracle, I had a second chance at life. And this one was going to be different. I pledged that whatever fact I discovered in that book, that was going to be my mission from now on. To understand Howard Rourke's astonishing words. I'm not capable of suffering completely. I never have. It only goes down to a certain point, and then it stops. I didn't know it at the time, but the pledge I'd made was Ayn Rand's definition of courage. Courage is the practical form of being true to existence. Whenever we take a truth of existence and attempt to put it into practice, we exhibit courage. That is what I spent the next 6 years of my life doing, and that is the second chapter of this talk. Having accepted good, anti-anxiety premises, that we have an integrated mind and body, that it exists no matter what anybody says, and that it's independently ours, not anyone else's, what do we do next to put those ideas into practice? The 3 categories are self-care, listening, and writing. And I'll start with self-care. I'll tell you what was the first thing I did with my brand new life after my anxious meltdown. I finally got some sleep. I ate some food. I gave myself time, and I took deep breaths. Now, I don't want to run afoul of Thomas's advice here. He has a great book out where he warns you against people who give obvious advice. It's a great chapter. The reason I give you this advice is that it's not always obvious. Giving yourself sleep, time, food, and air is deceptively hard, even for, especially for anxious people and especially for driven people. There are executives who still cannot get themselves to get a full night's sleep, and they say that they're built differently, and I don't believe them. They say they only need 5 hours. I think they're lying. Skipping these things will hurt your performance, and it will make you more anxious. Maybe not in the short term, but absolutely in the long term. Ayn Rand herself, I think, is terrible about this. The heroes in her books are always on no sleep. They're always drinking coffee. I don't need to talk about this one as much because I feel like Lee Sandstead just talked about a bunch of this. After self-care, the next thing I started doing in my life was listen. I listened to how I felt about things, and instead of repressing the feeling, I acted accordingly. Do you know what was the first thing I did at my college after I got some sleep? I slacked off. I submitted my remaining assignments pretty much as they were. I cleaned them up a little bit, but I didn't really feel like stressing about them anymore. There was one particular assignment. It was a building code review assignment that I just never gotten my head around. I've been putting it off for weeks, and it was overdue, and I hated the assignment, and I was furious with myself for not getting it done. Post-meltdown, I said, I don't feel like it. And I didn't turn it in at all. It was the first time in my life that I had not turned in an assignment. My grade point average plummeted from a perfect 4.0 to a 3.98. Yeah, well, who cares? It wasn't long before my parents were fighting again. My mom was hiding in the kitchen, agitated. Your father is really done it this time. And remember, it was customary in my family for me to comfort her, and she's my mom who loved me, so I had a duty to her. But with my new premises, I felt differently. She said, your father's doing what he always does. I said, you should get a divorce. She said, what? I will never do that. I said, okay. And I walked past her into the kitchen, and I microwaved a burrito because I was hungry. That was why I came in there. My parents are still together, by the way. They'll watch this later. Love you guys. As I practiced listening to and acting in accordance with how I really felt about things, I started to feel a weight lift off my shoulders. Now, I know we have a lot of intelligent young people here, advocates of reason, not emotionalism. You might be saying, isn't this irrational? Isn't listening to your emotions all the time just another kind of primacy of consciousness? How do I know which emotions are right and which ones are wrong? These are good questions, so allow me to maybe blow your minds here. There is no such thing as a wrong emotion. One more time, there is no such thing as a wrong emotion. I'll explain what I mean. Emotions are a physical and chemical fact of your brain's limbic system. Now, you can try to ignore or minimize or condemn your emotions until you become numb to them, and you might end up with a defective limbic system, but emotions will never be anything but your body's check engine light. Another analogy that Lee used. A sign that says that something is wrong, something in your deeper premises, something in your deeper unconscious needs to be addressed. You know, when I pitched this talk to Craig, he said, great, an anxiety talk. You're going to teach people to get over their anxiety and act. And I said, no, I'm going to teach people not to. That is why this section of the talk is not called acting, it's called listening. See, when we have an emotion, we have two options for what to do with it fundamentally. We can listen to it through expression, or we could ignore it through repression. And here, I want to draw a big fat line in the sand between acting in accordance with emotion and acting on emotion. When you listen to emotion, you can consciously embrace it. It becomes a part of your personality, and you act in accordance with it. When you repress an emotion, you ignore it, it becomes a part of your neurosis. Then you'll unconsciously manifest it in a variety of ways, and you will have no choice but to act under its influence. Suppose a man gets mugged. He feels emasculated, but he tells himself, get over it. He finds a new route to work, that's safer, and he uses that every day instead. Problem solved. Suddenly, though, he finds he doesn't know how to stand up to his boss. He has horrible nightmares. So every morning he stands in the mirror and repeats a series of mantras. You're safe, you're alone, you're relaxed. You're safe, you're alone, you're relaxed. But he doesn't feel relaxed. He feels anxious. So he gets a prescription for anxiety medication to help him repress further. But suppose, instead of repressing his anxiety, he listened to it. When you listen to an emotion, you allow your subconscious premise to become conscious. You will then be able to consider what the emotion is telling you about yourself and act accordingly. In reflecting on his anxiety about being mugged and about the dark, or about his nightmares and about his boss, he uncovers the deeper premise. It felt just like when he was a kid in middle school and he was small for his size and bullies would stuff him in a locker. The unconscious premise behind his anxiety was, I am helpless. So he decides that instead of repressing his anxiety, he'll listen to it. Instead of taking anxiety medication, he enrolls in jiu-jitsu classes, and he wrestles bigger men every week until they start to say, hey, you're pretty scrappy for a small guy. By uncovering the premise that he was helpless, he can make himself not helpless. Now suddenly he's not having nightmares, he goes to work, and he asks his boss for a raise. So when I tell you there are no wrong emotions, when I tell you to always listen to your emotions, this is why. If you repress your emotions, you fall prey to them. If you listen to your emotions, you have the opportunity to master them. Now, there's a bunch more questions I know people are going to have about listening to yourself because it's hard and it takes practice, so you can bring those to the Q&A. But I'll answer a few of the most common ones quickly. What if I feel like doing two things equally? I say that's a happy problem. You win either way. So you can literally flip a coin. The point is not to end up in an anxious paralysis. What if I feel like scrolling Instagram and TikTok all day? That's what I really feel like doing. Well, there's two possibilities here. The first possibility is that you don't actually feel like this. This is a shameful addiction. In that case, you don't really feel like scrolling social media all day. You're just using it as an outlet to hide from whatever it is really on your mind. So I would say try and uncover that. Now, the other possibility is you genuinely love scrolling social media all day, in which case I'd say maybe become a social media manager, or at the very least block out a few hours of the day for this thing that you love doing. Finally, what if I know what I feel like doing, but I'm too scared? I can't bring myself to do it. My saying for this is, it was worth it either way. I came up with it the first time I ever felt like asking a girl to dance with me, and I was terrified of asking for a dance. I was anxious as hell, but I felt like I wanted to be the sort of person who at least gave it a shot. So I thought of what was the worst thing that could happen if I maybe I'd ask her for a dance and she says, ew, no. And I asked myself if it would be worth it to do it either way, even if that was how she responded. And I decided it would be. Now, sometimes you're afraid to do something for good reason. I'm not saying take stupid risks, but always take worthwhile risks, because if you can bring yourself to do it, it will be worth it either way. Listening to what you love doing is how you become yourself. There was a little 5-point assignment in my college education that I actually did love. It was a tiny portion of my grade, so academically I could have just skipped it. But for whatever reason, I went hard on this assignment. It was a drawing of a wall section. Every company I interviewed with paused on that wall section drawing and said, I like this. You don't see this that often. When I got my first job, not long after my meltdown, I told myself, no matter what, I will only use this job to do work I love doing. Do you think that made me a bad employee? Did it make me a slacker? It was the opposite. After 5 years at the company, my reputation was, Seamus doesn't do everything, but what he does do, he does superlatively. Wall sections like the one I did in college became my specialty. And 5 years later, when the company had changed and I didn't feel like working there anymore, I quit. I got a new job. So listen to how you really feel about things, because that's how you become yourself. After doing some self-care and listening, you'll still have some anxiety sometimes. But as you might have realized by now, anxiety isn't really the enemy. The real enemy is the bad premises that you're harboring. And anxiety is just that check engine light that says something's wrong. As long as you keep challenging yourself, you will naturally encounter anxious situations, and you will keep uncovering hidden premises that you have to think about and analyze. The last big thing I started doing as I began my first job was to take all of those anxious, bottled-up thoughts and get them out. Write them out. For the first time in my life, I felt like writing. If I hated myself one day or I was mad at someone, I wrote down why. If I loved something that day, I wrote that down too. I didn't just write these things down to forget them either. I wrote them down to cherish them. I'd go back and read it and see if I agreed with myself. And writing is funny because you can have some kind of anxious premise consuming your whole being, but then you write it down on paper and it's this big. If listening is how we take our unconscious feelings and make them conscious, writing is a fantastic way for us to take our conscious feelings and distill the anxious feelings behind them. And as we distill our writing, I want to identify 2 different patterns to look for, which are overthinking and rationalization. Overthinking is frequently mistaken for a root problem. People say to you, oh, you think too much, you're overthinking this, you're an overthinker. Which I always hated, because I love thinking. Thinking is a virtue when you're thinking about the right thing. Overthinking can be a vice when you're using it to avoid what is really the issue. A classic overthinker is a young man or young woman who's nervous about someone they have a crush on. A guy might obsess about what he's going to say to a girl, even though having a pre-planned statement is just going to make him come off as awkward. A girl might obsess about what she's wearing to make sure she leaves a good impression, even though the guy will only notice the expression on her face. The root issue they both have is their repressed fear of intimacy. What you need is not the perfect first impression with this person. What you need is like 100 bad impressions so that you get comfortable in your own skin. But they're obsessing over this anxiety that they have as a way that they won't have to address that discomfort that they have. Another example, at my first job, I would write an email out to my colleagues, and I would read over the email like 5 or 6 times to make sure I didn't have any typos in it and to make sure I wasn't saying any of the right things. I was anxious about being part of the team. And eventually I realized as I got experience that a coworker, like a crush for that matter, is a person just like me. And they make mistakes, and if you say the wrong thing in an email, my bad, write a follow-up email. It's not that big a deal. Overthinking is pretty natural, but when we do make a mistake, we can fall into a much more dangerous thought pattern called rationalization. A rationalization is a lie that we tell ourselves to cover for an emotion that we don't want to confront. So let's suppose Bert is rationalizing about Mary Poppins. It might start with a dramatization or an exaggeration. Oh, I have a date with Mary Poppins tonight, and it's going to be the most wonderful date ever. We're meant to be. He's already desperate for his affection. He's already ahead of his skis, but he doesn't want to confront that, so he's just going to lie to himself about the nature of the universe and say, this is really the big deal. Now suppose the date doesn't go that well. Well, next what we end up with is a catastrophization. It was the worst date ever. She hates me. I'm never going to be loved. Finally, the third thing you'll get, and this is the worst kind of rationalization, you'll get a negation. I didn't want to date Mary Poppins anyway. I'm not that kind of guy. I'm better off alone. You know what I like? I like sweeping chimneys. That's what I like to do. I'm just going to do that in my life. That's what I'm really about. And negations are really the most pernicious thing, because when you have a desire and then you fall short of it, a negation is when you kill the desire so that you don't have to deal with the breach between them. And you shrink your world, and your world just partitions inward and becomes smaller and smaller until you feel like there's nothing really in the world that belongs to you, and you spiral out of control. So writing is really important because it gives you the opportunity to look at these negations that you're telling yourself on a daily basis that you might have stopped even realizing that you're telling yourself, and to audit them, and to say, you know what, maybe it's not over. Maybe I need to give myself a chance here. Now, I have a very particular method of journaling, and people can ask about that if they're curious. But the main thing is just to write down whatever it is you're feeling and then look at it, and then decide if it's true or false. And if it's true, you should act on it. And if it's false, try and figure out what it is that you're avoiding by lying to yourself. I came a long way in the last 6 years. I'd always loved singing, but I had decided as a kid that I was never going to sing for people because I was too anxious. That changed. I faced more fears. I made friends. And I learned to dance. I had exercised my worst philosophic premises, and I had exercised courage. But I still wanted wisdom. I was still asking myself what had happened to me, and I was still grasping for Rourke's certain point. It wasn't a self exactly. Everyone has a self, but so few people have this benevolence, this psychological invulnerability that I saw in Rourke and Bert. So I started looking into different schools of thought on psychology until finally I found it. And it came from a psychotherapist named Mark Derian, to whom I owe a huge debt of gratitude for making this talk be good, because he described the anxiety phenomenon with a very simple diagram. And it looks like this. First, you have yourself, your identity, your ego, your consciousness, your I. Outside of that is the world, filled with threats. When a threat infiltrates yourself, we get anxiety. And when we repress that anxiety, it festers down into our identity. Comes OCD and misery. Mark Derian defines OCD as I can't and I have to. I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. Here's the important part. In between ourself and the world outside, we have boundaries. When we grow our boundaries by exercising confidence. Mark Derian defines confidence as I could if I wanted to, but I won't if I choose not to. So instead of taking the threat that comes in and pushing it down into OCD, we can kick it up into confidence when we reflect on the anxiety and we take a positive action. Now, what had happened to me was after I addressed my premises and began taking risks and taking action in my life, I was building that boundary for myself. When I told my parents, I'm not going to mediate your stupid arguments anymore, that was me building that boundary. There are those who preach that we should not have boundaries, that we are our brother's keepers, that all men are one interdependent superorganism. I was raised to basically see myself as part of a superorganism with my family. My father's problems were my problems, and vice versa. It was only by discovering the philosophic premise that I am my own person that I was able to take the steps to defeat my anxiety and to finally come to you all today and say, I'm Seamus Riley, And though I experience anxiety, it only goes down to a certain point. As long as there's that certain point, it's not really pain. Now, I want to leave you today with the Serenity Prayer. The Serenity Prayer was written by a Christian, but Ayn Rand herself regarded it as a tremendous achievement. And it goes like this: grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And if we look back, that's what we did today. We talked about independence, primacy of existence, and mind-body integration, facts of reality, premises that I needed to accept in order to confront my anxiety to heal. Then we talked about courage, where to take it from there, how to put those ideas into practice, taking care of myself, listening to how I really felt about things, and writing about all the things that I didn't know how I felt about them. And finally, we found out there is such a thing in psychology as boundaries. We build them by listening to ourselves and acting accordingly, and we experience compounding results, allowing us to take bigger and bigger risks. So I'll say it one more time now that it really means something. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'll now take questions. Layla?
Thank you. It was really useful. My question is, I'm going to try to simplify it, but how do you advise to manage attention between like pushing yourself too much and overworking to, let's say, finish everything on your to-do list for the day,
Yep.
and the anxiety that it causes, versus knowing that you could probably have less anxiety by actually pushing yourself a little more and finishing off all those tasks and then resting, like the dilemma between those two, basically. I don't know if...
Right. Some to-do lists are funny. Sometimes I write down everything I need to do on a to-do list, and then I do none of those things, and I do what I really felt like doing. The most important thing with a to-do list is to make sure there's one thing on the list that you're going to actually do, and you might find that the rest of the things, they didn't really matter. So a to-do list might be a good starting point to kick some things out of your life completely. Because the fact that you're writing it down, the fact that you're having to stress about it, means maybe you weren't that excited about doing it. Otherwise, you would be doing it. Now, you're going to end up with a lot of priorities in your life, and you're going to have to write down to-do lists. So I'm a big list guy. I have tons and tons of lists. But the metric by which you know if the list is working is, are you doing your favorite thing on the list right now? So does that help answer your question? Okay.
How do you go from I can't to I could if I wanted to without lying to yourself?
Yeah. So there's a fantastic line that Mark Derian draws between a good affirmation and a bad affirmation. There are people who they're anxious about doing this thing. They feel like they can't do this thing. And so what they do is they stand in front of the mirror and they repeat to themselves, I'm handsome, I'm handsome, I'm handsome. So that they're trying to convince themselves they are. And what's going to happen if you do that is, even if you somehow do convince yourself that you're a god among men and women are going to want to come out and attach themselves to you, all you've done is set yourself up for failure again. So the good kind of affirmation is the true kind, which is, I'm not the most attractive guy, but I have some good qualities, and I've even maybe written down what those are. So, you're going to be catastrophizing sometimes. You're like, I'm terrible. I'm not good for anything. It's a lie. What you do is you identify the fact. I have a document in my journal, and I call it the slap. It's named after one of the moments where one of the characters in Atlas Shrugged gets slapped. It's like, pull yourself together, And I just wrote down in that document the things that I like about myself that are true. And if you start at that baseline, as long as it's a true baseline, what you do is you go out in the world and you're like, this was me when I started learning to drive. I'm going to learn to drive. I think I suck at it. I'm anxious about it. But you know what? Everyone else who's going out on the road, they're going out on the road knowing that there's crappy drivers out there, one of which is me. So it's actually, they're stuck in here with me. So I'm just going out here trying to drive and trying to live my life. I'm not perfect, but no one is. So I'm going to start with the fact that I know how to turn the wheel. I know the basics, and then that you can take pride in the basics as long as it's true. Yeah. Ben.
When you're like learning
Louder.
When you were learning new things and when you're doing dancing, do you believe there's any validity to the statement "fake it till you make it"? Did you ever feel like an imposter syndrome or anything when you were trying to go into those things?
Yeah, this is very similar to the last question. So you can take an attitude of I'm faking it. I don't think you have to fake it to make it. I would focus on the fact that, you know, if you're a beginner dancer, everyone was a beginner dancer once. You suck. It's more like suck until you make it, to me. There's nothing wrong with that, and it actually gives you a lot more like confidence once you then do succeed, because you were honest with yourself about the fact that you sucked, and now you can tell that you suck slightly less. So it builds from there. Juno, and then you.
So how do you do something, great talk by the way, how do you do something that you were never made to do, that you were never used to do being a child? Like, for example, for me, especially, is expressing affection and gratitude. For you, it could be different. But
Yeah, how do you break conditioning?
Like, so you were surrounded by people, and it was just not a thing to do this thing. The best advice I can give there is build your own family. This is what I started doing. You know, when I was out of college, I knew I was shy. I knew I was like not socially confident. So I moved in with John Schilli because he was the most socially insane person I knew, who was not afraid to embarrass himself in front of anyone. And I was like, I need a little bit more of John Schilli in my life. So I surrounded myself with people who are going to model that behavior, because you're going to have an easier time overriding a social conditioning thing than erasing it. So yeah, find whoever is the antonym of whatever conditioning you're suffering from. Thank you. Yes, you in the back.
Okay. What are your thoughts on therapy and medication as tools for treating?
So, sorry, a little bit louder. What are my thoughts on therapy, and then something about medication? Yeah. Okay. So medication. I am not anti-medication. I used it as an example because medication is a fantastic way to repress stuff. But if medication is helping you to go out and take risks and to build your boundaries, good. Go ahead and use it. I personally would try to get off the medication just because I think it's a hassle and it's expensive. I don't want to be on the medication if I can choose not to. But if it's working for you, the symptoms aren't bad, go for it. Take the medication. Secondly, with regard to therapy, listening and writing, those things in my talk, are therapy. And in fact, the psychotherapist who I based a lot of the knowledge in the talk on has written a book called The Therapy Manifesto. This came out like 2 weeks ago. The timing is incredible. This book is blowing my mind. Mark Derian is like as revolutionary in psychology to me as Rand is in therapy. And I say that as someone who always thought therapy was like phony baloney stuff, where you just have to talk to someone and you try to feel better. But Mark Derian makes it actually a principled science. And yeah, lots more I could say about that. But very pro-therapy. Therapy is when you try to identify the premises that you're acting on. And also, one more note on that, I didn't mention talking to people. I said listening and writing, but talking to people is incredibly powerful. Your brain is on stimulants whenever you're looking a person in the eyes, because that is what your body has evolved to do. That's why we have a huge cranium. It's so that we can process minute changes in people's expression. Carl Jung's saying is we see ourselves in reflection. So the only reason why I didn't talk about talk therapy and I focused on writing therapy is because writing is the easiest to do yourself. But as you go out and build family, as you have people around you, talking to people is going to be immensely useful to understand things. So therapy is good in that regard. Yes, you.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on using AI as like a journaling tool, maybe to see broader patterns?
Yes.
Maybe not to like necessarily identify those premises.
Yep.
Like a therapist would be more appropriate for that. But.
Yeah, I know Mark Derian has a video that's called How to Use AI for Therapy, and I haven't watched it. So he probably has a better answer than I'm going to give. I have taken my entire journal, pushed it into ChatGPT, and asked it to tell me what it thinks. It's pretty funny. I mean, it's like it comes back and says, "Wow, you're so insightful." But I think the best thing, and this is how I use an AI for most things, is I don't use it to give me answers. I use it to ask me questions. So I would figure out what are the questions that you can use to identify your premises. How did I feel about that thing? When did I start to feel that about that thing? Craig might say, how did I reach this conclusion about myself? And if you have it ask you those questions, it might be easier for you to answer them through that, and then it might be able to probe. I don't know, depending on how good it is. Yep. Yes.
Yes, I have a question regarding procrastination.
Yes.
Like, when I have a goal in my head,
Mm-hmm.
I have a plan in my head, but I can't do the first step. And I cannot understand, like, this is just a fear, or this is not my goal.
Yep.
In my mind, like, no.
Yeah. So procrastination is like one of the fundamental bases for why psychology, why the field of psychology exists. Because what Derian will say frequently is, if it was as simple as knowing what is the correct thing to do, then everything would be philosophy. We would just learn the world and everything would happen. But psychology comes in when we know something is true, but we don't do it for some reason. And you can try to have like a whole bunch of regimens and like things that you say to yourself, the CBT approach of trying to kick yourself. And the example he gives is in the book is putting your alarm clock on the other side of the room so that you have to get out of bed to wake up. And it was funny to me because I do that, right? There's all these ways you can try to like kick yourself and torture yourself to do it. But ultimately what you need to identify is, why don't I feel like doing this thing? What is it that I really feel like doing? And there's a lot of answers to why that might be for yourself. I'm obviously an expert in procrastinating, but I would. The only other thing I'll say, and this goes back to Mary Poppins: every job that must be done involves an element of fun. And this also goes to when I started at my job, saying to myself, whatever I do at this job, I'm going to love what I do at this job. It wasn't that every job was like made to be fun, like a video game, but I looked at every piece of work that came onto my desk and I was like, what do I think is the cool part about this? And I focused on that. So if when you have something that you don't feel like doing, try and find the cool part. If there is no cool part to the work might suck. And that might mean you should be really doing something else that you would prefer to be doing. Okay? I think we got time for a few more. Yes?
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. And as someone who suffers anxiety often, I'll think in the future, or maybe if I'm good enough or not. I think that both having people to talk to and also spending time alone in a balance helps you to get through the things.
Mm-hmm.
But also as a music lover, as someone who enjoys listening to music, I find that to be very important to process it, to get the courage to give some self-care and to be in order mentally.
Yep.
Do you think that maybe it's also a good way to unify it with, instead of talking to people, it also keep doing that, interacting with artists, like listening to them or maybe reading, can also be considered like trying to focus your problem or your anxiety onto something?
So the question, I think, is how do I find music to be useful in the process of therapy and self-healing and growing? I absolutely love music. I do not police the type of music that I listen to, but I do notice in hindsight the times when I was depressed, the types of music I was listening to, and the times I was feeling other things, what type of listening to. I think music allows you to feel whatever it is you're feeling more vividly. And that can be really useful when you're trying to accentuate and articulate your feelings. So I would just make sure whatever music you're listening to, if you're trying to listen to music intentionally, you feel the hell out of it. If that's death metal, then maybe that's really where you're at right now. And so I would not suppress that, but I would be very purposeful about the music I listen to, and then I'd say, you better freaking love it. I had my Spotify playlist had a whole bunch of stuff that's just pop music that I listen to all the time. I shunted it into another playlist. I was like, what is the weird stuff that I feel like listening to right now? And I kept that, and that's what I listen to on a daily basis. So, Carl.
I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
I think you got standing ovation while everybody was sitting. 3 C's. Your presentation was very clear, compelling, and I think above all, it was quite courageous for you to be so open about for a series of painful experiences. I think it was extraordinary. I don't know that I've seen that in that way before. So another C. Congratulations.
Well, I certainly appreciate the compliment, sir. I think when it comes to being open about the things in your life, it helps if you've reached a point of safe harbor, which I have. You know, when you've overcome something, you kind of look back on the story behind you, and it's kind of cool that that's your story, and you kind of do want to share it with other people if the occasion arises. It's also a point of pride. So I guess what I'll say is it was pretty easy to do. Mr. Sandifer.
Just to reinforce something you were saying earlier about being honest with yourself in your list, just an interesting historical tidbit. In 1800, when he was running for president, Thomas Jefferson did this. He took out a piece of paper and he wrote on it because he was feeling depressed about the attacks against him in the media. He wrote out, sometimes I have wondered whether the world is better for my having lived at all. And so I'm going to make a list of the things I've accomplished in my life. And number one was when he was in his 20s, he had helped with a project to remove large boulders from the Rivanna River so that boats could go up and down it. And number two was the Declaration of Independence. So if somebody like that can feel, at a dark moment when he wonders whether his life's been worth living and has to do this therapy, it's probably good advice for the rest of us all.
Yeah. That was why I had that slide on rationalization and negations. It's kind of ridiculous when you go from a period of like a super dark place to being better again. You look back on yourself and like, man, what was I saying to myself? Like you build up these little moments, and I always compare it to trying to demolish a cathedral with a hand chisel. You lie to yourself in little ways all days. I wasn't that good at that. I wasn't that good at this. This was kind of stupid. This was second-handed reasons. Like you slowly kind of pick away at whatever it is that supports your ego until you're denying that. You have to remind yourself you wrote the Declaration of Independence. So I love that example. Thank you.
One more huge round of applause for David.